Ladies and gentlemen, Asian guy here. Stop what you're doing and listen because something just shattered. Something that took 3 decades to build just exploded in a single afternoon. The $2.4 trillion North American trade architecture that's been the backbone of continental commerce since 1994 is hanging by a thread. And it's not just hanging, it's snapping in real time. Trump just announced comprehensive tariffs on Canadian imports. Energy, minerals, agriculture, manufacturing, everything. These aren't negotiating tariffs. These tariffs will fundamentally reshape goods flow across the longest undefended border in the world. This isn't trade policy. This is destruction of an integrated economic system operating seamlessly for 3 decades. NAFTA created a single continental production network, turning Canada, the US, and Mexico into one economic machine. Every day, $2 billion of goods crosses the US-Canada border. That's $730 billion annually, flowing back and forth across an invisible line. The U.S. imports $430 billion annually from Canada. Canada isn't a trading partner. Canada is a supply chain extension, the resource extraction arm of the North American economy. That arm is about to be severed, and the bleeding is going to be massive. Mainstream media isn't telling you this move didn't happen in a vacuum. This is geopolitical strategy building for months. While everyone focused on China, Ukraine, the Middle East, the real target was always next door. Look at the timing. Global energy crisis, supply chain disruptions, agricultural prices spiking. Now the US blows up its most stable economic relationship. This doesn't happen by accident. Someone calculated that destroying a $2.4 trillion trade relationship was worth the strategic gain. But gain for whom? And at whose expense? The cascading effects will be biblical. Canada supplies 20% of US oil imports and 25% of electricity. When tariffs hit, energy costs spike immediately. Every gas station, electric bill reflects that America's northern neighbor became a foreign adversary. Canada leads uranium, potash, nickel production, second largest aluminum producer, strategic materials powering nuclear reactors, EV batteries, defense systems, tariff strategic materials. You create shortages where no alternatives exist. While the US cuts itself off from Canadian resources, who fills the gap? China. China has systematically expanded in Canadian resource extraction for 5 years. They've been preparing for this exact moment. While the US imposes tariffs, China becomes Canada's primary export market. Resources that flowed south to fuel American industry now flow west to fuel Chinese industry. This isn't trade war. This is resource reallocation on a continental scale. The US just voluntarily handed China access to the entire Canadian resource base. Think about the agricultural implications. Canada is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, canola, and other grains. Canadian agriculture doesn't just feed Canada, it feeds significant portions of the global market, including the United States. When you put tariffs on food, you create food inflation. Not next year, not next quarter, immediately. American consumers are going to wake up to grocery bills that reflect the new reality that their northern breadbasket just became economically inaccessible. But the wheat doesn't disappear. It gets sold to other buyers. Buyers who didn't just destroy a 30-year economic partnership out of political spite. The automotive industry represents $100 billion in cross-border trade. Auto parts cross that border multiple times during manufacturing. That integration is about to be destroyed. Ford, GM, Tesla all have operations in both countries built on free trade assumptions. These companies now choose rebuild their production network or relocate outside North America. Many will relocate. The Canadian dollar collapsed since the announcement. Currency traders pricing in that Canada's largest trading partner became economically hostile. As the Canadian dollar weakens, exports become cheaper globally. Cheaper for everyone except the United States, which priced itself out. Americans pay higher prices, while the world benefits from Canadian economic distress. The irony is staggering. In an effort to protect American industry, this policy makes American industry less competitive globally. American manufacturers source inputs at higher prices, while competitors access those inputs at discount from economically weakened Canada. Economic self-sabotage dressed as economic nationalism. But there's a deeper game being played. This isn't just tariffs. This is forcing complete reorganization of North American economic relationships. Someone calculated that destroying the existing system is worth rebuilding it under different terms. Someone ran the numbers and decided that 3 decades of prosperity was expendable. Who benefits from chaos? Who profits when stable relationships are shattered? Look at the timing. Look at who's been positioning in Canadian resource markets while America focused elsewhere. Look at the capital flows, the mining acquisitions, the energy partnerships built over the past 5 years. This tariff announcement isn't creating chaos. It's clearing the field for players who prepared for this moment. Meanwhile, Mexico watches with growing alarm. If the U.S. destroys its relationship with Canada, What about US-Mexico trade? The USMCA was supposed to provide certainty. If that certainty disappears overnight, no trade relationship is safe. This creates domino effects throughout the hemisphere. Investment flowing toward North American integration, now reconsidering. Asian manufacturers using Mexico as gateway to North American markets, questioning whether that gateway is stable. Result? Massive capital reallocation. Investment flows toward other regional blocs. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, everyone except North America benefits from this self-imposed isolation. And here's what really terrifies me about this situation. This move is irreversible. Once you destroy trust in an economic relationship, once you prove that 30 years of integration can be eliminated with a single policy announcement, you can't rebuild that trust. Even if these tariffs are eventually removed, the knowledge that they can be reimposed at any moment fundamentally changes the calculus for every business decision. Canadian companies that have been relying on American markets are now going to diversify aggressively. They're going to build relationships with European and Asian buyers. They're going to reduce their dependence on American consumers. And once those relationships are built, once those supply chains are established, they don't come back just because tariffs are removed. American companies are going to face the same pressure in reverse. They're going to be forced to find alternative suppliers for inputs that have been coming from Canada for decades. They're going to build relationships with suppliers in other countries. And once those relationships are established, they become permanent features of the economic landscape. This isn't a temporary disruption. This is a permanent reorganization of hemispheric trade flows. And that reorganization is happening at the exact moment when global economic power is shifting away from the West and toward the East. China is watching all of this with barely concealed delight. While North America destroys its own economic integration, China continues building the Belt and Road Initiative. While the U.S. alienates its closest economic partners, China deepens its relationships with resource-rich nations around the world. The U.S. just voluntarily removed itself from competition for Canadian resources. China didn't have to wage economic warfare to access those resources. America just handed them over voluntarily. And this is where the mathematics become really terrifying. The North American economy represents approximately 28% of global GDP. That economic bloc has been one of the most successful examples of regional integration in history. It has been a source of stability and growth for 3 decades. That stability is now gone. That growth trajectory has been derailed. And the economic vacuum created by North American disintegration is going to be filled by other economic blocs that did not just destroy their own partnerships out of political calculation, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire situation is how predictable it was. The warning signs have been building for months. The rhetoric has been escalating. The groundwork has been laid. Anyone paying attention to the geopolitical currents could see that North American integration was being targeted for destruction. And yet, when the moment came, when the actual announcement was made, markets and analysts seemed genuinely surprised. As if 3 decades of economic partnership could survive the political chaos that has been building across the continent. This is what systemic failure looks like. Not a sudden shock from an unexpected source, but the predictable collapse of institutions that have been weakened by years of political stress. The $2.4 trillion North American trade relationship didn't die overnight. It was killed slowly, methodically, deliberately by political forces that calculated its destruction was worth more than its preservation. The real question now is whether this is an isolated incident or the beginning of a broader pattern. If the U.S. is willing to destroy its economic relationship with Canada, which other partnerships are at risk? Which other trade relationships are considered expendable in service of whatever larger strategy is being pursued? Because if this is the beginning rather than the end, if this is part of a systematic dismantling of international economic integration, then we're looking at a fundamental reorganization of the global economy. Not gradual evolution, but revolutionary change imposed through political will rather than market forces. And that kind of change never happens without massive unintended consequences. The people who design these policies, the strategists who calculate that destruction is worth more than preservation, they never account for the chaos that emerges when complex systems are deliberately broken. They never consider the domino effects. They never plan for what happens when the machine stops working. We're about to find out what happens when a $2.4 trillion economic relationship disappears overnight. We're about to discover whether 3 decades of integration can be unwound without devastating consequences for everyone involved. The answer, I fear, is that we're about to learn why some things, once broken, can never be repaired. What happens next isn't just about trade policy or tariffs. What happens next is about whether institutions that provided stability and prosperity for an entire generation can survive political forces determined to remake the world according to different principles. The North American trade order that built prosperity for 500 million people just became a casualty in a larger war. A war whose objectives aren't entirely clear, but whose methods involve systematic destruction of everything that used to provide economic certainty and stability. We're all about to live with the consequences, and those consequences are going to be permanent. But here's what they don't want you to understand about the real endgame behind this economic destruction. This tariff announcement was not made in isolation. It was coordinated with a series of financial moves that have been building for months beneath the surface of public awareness. Private equity firms with connections to energy infrastructure have been quietly positioning themselves to benefit from the supply chain disruptions that were always going to result from this policy. Commodity trading houses have been accumulating strategic positions in alternative supply routes that will become essential when traditional North American trade flows are severed. Shipping companies have been securing long-term contracts for routes that will replace the cross-border trucking and rail networks that are about to become economically unviable. The financial instruments that will profit from North American economic disintegration have already been purchased by the same institutional investors who publicly support the political rhetoric about economic nationalism. Currency trading algorithms have been programmed to exploit the volatility that was always going to result from deliberately destabilizing a $2.4 trillion economic relationship. Insurance companies have been restructuring their risk models to capture the premiums that businesses will be forced to pay for protection against political disruption of established commercial relationships. Resource extraction companies with operations outside the traditional North American supply chain have been expanding their capacity in anticipation of demand that will be redirected away from Canadian suppliers. Technology companies have been developing supply chain management software specifically designed to help businesses navigate the regulatory complexity that results when integrated markets are artificially fragmented. Legal firms have been hiring specialists in international trade law to represent the companies that will be filing billions of dollars in claims related to contract disruptions caused by unilateral policy changes. Consulting companies have been preparing implementation strategies for the industrial reshuffling that always follows the deliberate destruction of economic relationships that took decades to develop. Banking networks have been establishing the correspondent relationships that will be necessary to finance trade flows through more complex and expensive routing arrangements. Investment banks have been structuring the financial products that will be necessary to hedge against the increased uncertainty that results when political risk becomes the dominant factor in commercial decision-making. Logistics companies have been mapping the alternative transportation networks that will be essential when the most efficient routes between production and consumption are blocked by tariff barriers. This is not economic nationalism responding to external threats. This is economic engineering designed to benefit specific interests that profit from complexity, volatility, and the destruction of efficient market relationships. The North American middle class is about to discover that they weren't the intended beneficiaries of this economic restructuring. They were the intended casualties. The mathematical inevitability of this trajectory was calculated years ago by people who understand that political chaos creates financial opportunity for those prepared to exploit it. What you're witnessing isn't policy failure, it's policy success, just not for the people who were told they would benefit from it. I am John A.G. from Currency Archive.